Welcome back to talkSPORT End Zone, talkSPORT's dedicated NFL YouTube channel with myself, Will Varney. And look, we're building up to the draft. We can't wait for it to get underway. Just over a week away from the first round, getting underway in Green Bay. And look, we're analysing certain teams' needs, desires ahead of the draft, and also the importance the draft will hold. We have a couple of conversations already on the channel. We spoke about the New York Jets. We spoke about the Las Vegas Raiders as well with Mitchell Renz, which was a really interesting conversation. If you haven't heard it already, make sure to check that one out. But it's not just teams who, might be picking within the top 10. We're going to be focusing on other teams as well, and maybe teams who are going under the radar. So make sure to stay tuned for that. But where today takes us, we are going to be focusing a team picking in the first 10 of the draft, and a really interesting situation developing at the New Orleans Saints. So much talk about the direction of this team, whether it was going to be a rebuild, a retooling, Kellen Moore coming in as the new head coach, and then obviously that big news last week dropping about the quarterback situation and maybe Derek Carr's future as a Saint. Pleasure to talk us all through it, to get some insight. It's great to say Ross Jackson, Saints beat writer and, of course, host of the Locked On Saints podcast, joins us here on talkSPORT End Zone. Ross, thank you so much for joining me. How are you, my man?
Oh, doing great. Well, thanks so much for having me on, man. Glad to be here with you.
It's really great to have you with us. And I wanted to start by, obviously, I alluded to it there, that quarterback situation. Yeah. And it's fascinating right now to see when that news dropped last week about Derek Carr and this shoulder injury that he's suffering with. I wanted to start by getting your thoughts on how much was this news a surprise to you when you heard it? And how has the reaction been from amongst Saints supporters to what the future potentially holds at that position?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was certainly a shock to us. I mean, we had spoken with New Orleans Saints' new head coach, Kellen Moore, just a week prior or 2 weeks prior. The days are all running together at this point in the offseason, but very shortly prior. And, they were talking about how great things are going with Derek Carr and how, they're excited to be back in the building and working together beginning on April 14th, which was the beginning of offseason workouts for the team and everything. And so for the news to drop that Derek Carr's season could be over before it begins, just 3 days before April 14th, when the team was set to report for offseason workouts, was a bit of a surprise. But I will say that even though it was a surprise to us, it doesn't sound like it was that much of a surprise to the New Orleans Saints, who have known about this for some time, but maybe have just been kind of keeping it under wraps for any number of understandable reasons. As for the fan response, it's been a little bit of a mixed bag. I think the diehard Saints fans are really interested in how much this potentially shapes or changes the team's approach to its future. A lot of Saints fans have been hoping that the team would just kind of press the reset button in a way and then begin to build for, what's next for the franchise. Whereas some folks that were more Derek Carr fans than they were necessarily New Orleans Saints fans sort of look at this as a disappointing situation in which they don't get to see their favorite player potentially in 2025. So it kind of depends on what the vested interest is in the, for the fan. But I think a lot of people are most intrigued to kind of see what this means about the, let's call it, changing course now for the New Orleans Saints this offseason.
Before we touch on the vision and what's looking ahead to what's to come in the draft, I wanted to ask whether you were maybe surprised to see Derek Carr, coming back into the building. It felt like at the end of last season, this contract that had been handed out, he's entering his third year of a 4-year deal, $150 million. I know you've been speaking recently on the podcast about this contract and whether it could potentially go down as one of the worst in NFL history if Carr is not to return. Were you surprised that maybe Carr, come the end of last season, that Mickey Loomis was very keen on Carr to stay?
Yeah, I don't think I was super surprised by it. It's just not the decision that I would have made. But again, there's a reason why I get paid to podcast, not make decisions for $1 billion corporations. So maybe there's a reason for that, right? But for me, this was an opportunity once you hired the new head coach to kind of cleanly part ways, give Derek Carr an opportunity to go and be somewhere where he doesn't have to navigate a rebuild. He's got probably 2 or 3 seasons of his top level of play left, more than likely, in the NFL, just based on average quarterback career, timing and everything. So let him go and do that in a place where he could potentially contend or try to finally get to / win, a playoff game and all those other things. I don't think that the Saints are in that situation. I think that this is a team that's going to kind of slug through 2025, even with Derek Carr at the helm, and then kind of really start to see their rebuild and their kind of building towards success happen over the course of 2026 and 2027. I think this is a multi-year process for New Orleans. And so even though that's a decision that I would have made, I wasn't surprised to see the Saints do what it is they typically do, which is be patient. And sometimes they do it to a flaw. We saw that with Dennis Allen. They held on to Pete Carmichael at all, and then also held on to him for too long. And so I think that there's like certain things that we've seen in their history, that in their recent history, that kind of suggests that, like, yeah, they're probably going to roll with Derek Carr. So I wouldn't say that I was surprised. Certainly would have said that it would have made a different decision. And now if the Saints end up not having Derek Carr moving forward, because if he doesn't play in 2025, it was already kind of a foregone conclusion that he'd be gone in 2026 anyway, then that means that he's already taken his final snap as a New Orleans Saint. And that means out of 68 total possible games, he appeared in 27. They won 14, threw 26 touchdowns to just over, I think it was 11 interceptions, if I recall correctly. Not a shining situation in terms, or shining result for that 4-year, $150 million contract, which I don't think goes down as one of the worst in NFL history, because the Albert Haynesworth contract from the former Washington Commanders is way too hard to beat. But I do think goes down as one of the potential worst deals, and then the return that you got from it in the Saints franchise history for certain.
You mentioned there about looking to almost slug through 2025 with an eye on 2026. But I find this situation fascinating, with the vision of the front office looking ahead to this season, because I expected it to be almost a full-blown rebuild. And then, a 5-12 record last season. But then you look at what some of the moves they're making in free agency. They restructured Derek Carr, but then they bring in Justin Reed. They bring back Brandon Cooks. They give an extension to Chase Young. And I don't know, it feels as if this is a team that maybe believes they could be competitive in the NFC South next year. Is that the feeling that you get as well?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a team that absolutely believes they can compete. I don't agree with them, but I think that's what they I don't think that that's what they think. I know very well that that's what they think. So let me clarify my language there. But yeah, no, they absolutely believe that they're a team that will be able to go and compete here in 2025. And good, you should. Every team, from the past Super Bowl winner to the worst, to the number one overall pick, should believe that they can go in and compete. That's the idea, right? You and I don't jump on podcasts and radio shows going, this might not be my best one before we hit record, right? Like, we would never do that. And so I wouldn't expect anything less from the organization. But the reality of what the performance is going to be is that they have a brand new offensive system, brand new defensive system, entirely new coaching staff, made very few improvements this offseason via free agency, did a lot of run it back work, and now don't have the starting quarterback that they were building it all around. And so, the reality of it is that if they do succeed in trying to compete, is that it's going to be a massive surprise and a really exciting one for a lot of Saints fans. And so I think that that's a fine direction to go, is trying to compete. No issue with that. But that is very much what this organization is intent on trying to do in 2025.
So how destabilizing then is that injury news for Derek Carr in terms of that vision for this season? A lot of discussion about the quarterback position, which we'll get into fully, but does it feel like at the moment that Spencer Rattler is going to be the one with the keys come the 2025 season, or is there going to be a real focus on, in this draft, making sure they find a guy who's either going to compete with Spencer Rattler or is going to take the helm as a franchise quarterback?
Yeah, let me start with your question about destabilizing, because I think that's a really, really good question. I think that the idea of how it destabilizes what it is that they were trying to do going into 2025 depends on the timeline. When we learned about it on, Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern time on April 11th, more than certainly was not when the New Orleans Saints found out about it. So it would depend upon the destabilization gets worse with the more decisions having been made this offseason before knowing about the injury. So if they're going through and they're retaining their roster and they're trying to keep guys around Derek Carr that he's comfortable with, and they're making all those decisions, and then they find out that Derek Carr is not going to be available for the 2025 season, big kind of problem there. If they knew that might be the case, even if they knew it might be the case, and then built with that in mind, then I think that they're going to be in a better position. So it's going to really be all about what the timeline is, which, if I'm being honest, we still don't really know what the timeline is at this point. I think we'll get some clarity on that in the coming weeks, but we just don't have that information at this moment. The next part is, your question about Spencer Rattler. I think right now, if you look at this roster, the other three quarterbacks behind Derek Carr, Spencer Rattler, who was, of course, the fifth round rookie from last year, started 6 games. And then you have Jake Haener, who was drafted 2 years ago, started a game last year. And then you have Ben DiNucci, who was, late addition when Derek Carr was dealing with injuries last year and has some 2 years of overlap from the Dallas Cowboys with new head coach Kellen Moore. And so you got the veteran kind of leader that can help to translate a little bit of what it is that Kellen Moore is going to do. But then the conversation becomes which quarterback between Jake Haener and Spencer Rattler is going to be the guy. I think that the Saints have shown you what they believe in Spencer Rattler continuously going back to him last year. They went to Jake Haener once and then ended up benching him 2 quarters in. And so I think that you're probably feeling pretty good about the idea that that's probably going to be Spencer Rattler's job, unless the Saints were to draft a quarterback here in 2025, which is possible. But then you have to ask the question, where did they draft that quarterback in 2025? Is it a 5th round pick as well? Because if so, that player is just coming in to compete. If it's the number 9 overall selection, then it's a different story. But as of right now, yeah, I would expect Spencer Rattler to be the guy. Let's call him the leader in the clubhouse for now, to be the starter in 2025 if Derek Carr is indeed unable to go.
You mentioned there the 9th overall pick. The Saints have 9 overall picks, with 6 of them being in the first 4 rounds. So this is a great draft in order to maybe just fill some holes and maybe just get a depth of, and maybe some quality. And I know that the Saints have a bit of a track record of maybe just handing picks away, essentially. But surely this is a really good opportunity for this front office, for Mickey Loomis, not just for this season, but for the future of this organization, to maybe make some waves in this draft and get some real quality in with some real young cornerstone pieces, because this is an aging team, is it not?
Yeah, absolutely. You got a lot of players that are over 30 years old going into this season. I say as a person over 30 years old, by the way, I'm not, I'm not disenchanted here, but, and they've invested over, I think it's over 100, it's certainly over $110 million in those players that are just over the age of 32 or 32 or older. And so I think with all of that in consideration, that the next thing that you look at is, okay, how do you utilize this draft to get younger? We saw the Saints not necessarily go out and spend a ton in free agency. They brought back players. They brought in a couple of other players, like you mentioned earlier, but not really doing a lot of, wholesale shopping or wholesale changes in the roster. So to me, this made this offseason feel more like it was about addition by addition as opposed to addition by replacement. And so now what you're looking at is what can you add in this year's draft? As you mentioned, the Saints have 6 selections in the top 131 picks of this year's selection process, which I think is a really good place to be, because this year's draft, it's going to be pretty hard to delineate between the level of talent that you're getting in the middle of round 1 from the end of round, the middle of day 2. End of round 2 into beginning of round 3. And so you have a lot of opportunities within all that to be able to potentially get yourself starters. And the Saints have a few selections within that range. And so I think that's going to help them out quite a bit. And this is an opportunity here for a team that has taken amongst the fewest number of draft picks to actually select players in the last decade. This is going to be a situation where I think you see the New Orleans Saints walk away with a bigger than usual draft class, or certainly should be. My biggest question is they have no selection in the 5th round. They have 1 in the 6th and then 2 in the 7th. Are they really going to make those 6th and 7th round selections, or are they going to try to move those selections up to get, better talent, higher talent, more potential, whatever it might be that they seem? Those are going to be the 3 that I'm most interested to see what they actually do with, or potentially even future picks to be able to advance some of those. Because when you're drafting those 6th or 7th round guys, those guys don't often make the roster. And so can you move any of those picks into that 5th round so that maybe you can, take a higher percentage swing, let's say?
Well, we know that Mickey Loomis is not scared of making those decisions in terms of trading up. We've seen it especially in the first round in particular. I wanted to ask you about the GM, Mickey Loomis, and maybe how the fans are feeling about him right now, because it does feel like he's quite a polarizing figure. It does feel like there is, amblings of discontent around his position. So he's got a very close relationship with the Benson family, so it doesn't feel like he's almost indispensable. How are the fans feeling about his position, and is he feeling any pressure right now in terms of his role?
Yeah, I think every general manager and every coach feels pressure going into a season, and especially when you're a general manager right now that's pioneering a ship that's missed the playoffs for the last 4 seasons. Think about it is that you got to remember too that Mickey Loomis's all-time record is 203 and 152. He's a winning general manager, and this organization trusts that he can get the team back to those winning ways. The Dennis Allen experiment, which was meant to try to extend the Sean Payton days, which were the single most successful days of this franchise's history, did not work. And maybe Mickey Loomis would have made the decision to fire Dennis Allen this offseason. It doesn't sound like he wanted to make the decision to fire him in season, but owner Gail Benson apparently helped to push for that. And so that got done. Now, this is really the first time that Mickey Loomis is operating from outside of the Sean Payton era. So it's one of the reasons why you're seeing him get another chance. But I do think that there's, or not another chance, get a chance at this point. And so I do think that there is a level of pressure that's there for him. I think this is an incredibly important hire, not year, but hire for Mickey Loomis. I think that if Kellen Moore comes in here in New Orleans and it doesn't work out, then Kellen Moore won't be the only one out the door in a few years. But I don't think that Mickey Loomis would be out before Kellen Moore, if that makes sense, unless something were to completely, fall apart. As for the fan perspective of it all, look, anytime that you have a team that your favorite team misses the playoffs 4 years in a row and has some misses in the NFL draft, has some misses in terms of, coaching hire and things like that, there's going to be some discontent amongst the fan base. And there certainly is, I think, deserved discontent by the fan base. We've seen the Superdome empty during games. We've seen, opposing teams outnumber supporting teams, it feels like, in the lower bowl areas in some games. Even on national television at one point, that felt like that happened. And so I think that those are all the indications of discontentment from your fan base. And I think everyone understands that. The Saints have not put a winning product on the field for a few years. They haven't made the postseason for a few years, and they just came off of one of the worst performances of, I think it's the last 20 years of New Orleans Saints football in that 5-12 season. So yeah, you got a lot of people that are frustrated there, but I don't think that anybody is frustrated without reason. And I don't think that the organization at all is surprised by the frustration. The hope from the organization now is that they've made the right hire to be able to take things back into the right direction for the franchise.
Well, like you mentioned, it's an all-important draft for Mickey Loomis, that front office, for Kellen Moore as well in his first year as a head coach with the Saints. So looking at that 9th overall pick, I'm intrigued to know what you would do and which positions as well do you feel like the Saints need to prioritize in this draft? Because there's a lot of conversations about the offensive line and, say, Trevor Penning, and really struggling to make inroads there since he was drafted. The wide receiver room as well. Obviously, a lot of talk about Chris Olave and worries about his health and his production last season, in particular. Rashid Shaheed coming back from that season-ending injury. So which positions are you looking to prioritize? And Ross, you're in the chair, 9th overall pick. What are you doing?
Yeah, look, I think the simple answer in terms of what position is, the most important position for the New Orleans Saints to address, the answer is yes, right? Like you can throw a dart and hit any position and be happy with that. So I think for me, if I were making the decision, the names that I'm looking for and hoping are still on the board, number one is defensive tackle Mason Graham out of Michigan. Highly unlikely that he's going to be there at 9, but one of the kind of quote unquote highly unlikely guys that's the most likely to potentially make it, beyond guys like, Abdul Carter out of Penn State, Travis Hunter out of Colorado. Like those guys definitely not making it, but Mason Graham, there's a chance. And so I'm looking for his name. I'm watching for Arizona wide receiver Tetaroa McMillan. There's a lot of controversy around him in terms of a video that's 3 years old talking about not liking to watch film and stuff like that. Shocker. Most NFL players don't like to watch film. It's not that shocking. And so it is what it is. But he's also got 18 touchdowns over the course of the last 2 seasons and is a dominating factor that you could add to that wide receiver room that's coming off of injury pretty much across the board. And so I think that's another one that I'd be watching out for. I think there's some question marks that Michigan cornerback Will Johnson has to answer. Turf toe injury into the season last year. Hamstring injury limited him during the pre-draft process this year. There's speed question marks, and he didn't run a 40. I don't know when the last time a cornerback was drafted in the first round without a 40-yard time. I don't know if that matters anymore, as fewer and fewer players are actually running those 40-yard dashes these days and participating in the workouts. And so those are 3. I'd throw Penn State's Tyler Warren, the tight end over there in there as well. If the Saints got lucky enough, or if I got lucky enough and I was selecting and all 4 of those guys are on the board, I'm probably going Mason Graham out of all of them. But man, the 2 pass catchers would be really, really tough to pass up on. And if Mason Graham's not there, then I'm going for one of those pass catchers.
I find it really interesting you didn't mention a quarterback.
Yeah.
So looking at that quarterback position then, if that's something that you don't maybe see as a necessity in the first round, are there any of these names of these other quarterbacks who, we know that it looks likely at the moment that Shadur Sanders, Jackson Dart, Jalen Milroe all attending the first round of the draft in Green Bay. So you would like to think that maybe they'll be gone on the very first night of the draft. Are there any of these other guys? I know Tyler Shuck came into the building for a visit on the same day that the news came out about Derek Carr. So are there any of these guys that you think would be maybe a day two flyer that the Saints look at to maybe compete with, say, Spencer Rattler?
I think that there's potential for a day two guy, but really what I'm watching is the New Orleans Saints take that pick number 40 and a future selection and then move into the bottom of the first round to still get a first round quarterback. The reason why you do that, and we think back to like 2018, Lamar Jackson, this is what the Baltimore Ravens did. They actually traded back from their earliest selection in the first round, and then landing at their new spot in the teens, they took tight end Hayden Hurst. And then they took their 53rd overall selection or 57th overall selection. It was somewhere in the 50s. Well, I'm sorry, I can't remember which one it was. But they took that pick, and then they packaged it with a second round pick for the next year, and then like a fifth round pick from later. And then they moved up to pick 32 with the Philadelphia Eagles, who ironically pick at 32 again this year, to draft Lamar Jackson. And I could see the New Orleans Saints doing that. I'm not fully convinced that the New York Giants pass on Shadur Sanders. I'm not fully convinced that they do that. I'm also not fully convinced that the Saints are in on Shadur Sanders. I'm looking at the other guys that are like Jackson Dart and Tyler Shuck, who could potentially be guys that you move up for, draft them at the bottom of the first round. And the reason why you do that with those guys is because you get that fifth year option, gives you an extra year of cost control, extra year of rookie contract effectively on that you can plan for, which just kind of extends your ability to be able to maximize a rookie deal, which is where you can go and spend all your money at all the other positions. And so you really want to be able to get an extra year on that. And so if the Saints really love a guy like Tyler Shuck or really love a guy like Jackson Dart, but only like Shadur Sanders, I could see the Saints passing on Sanders, but then moving up to grab one of those other guys at the bottom of the first round.
Final couple of questions from me, Ross. Really appreciate your time joining us on the channel. I wanted to put forward a potential scenario.
Sure.
And I know that obviously we look at, say, Alvin Kamara, and the Saints have, extended his contract. He had good production last year despite contending with injuries. But if Ashton Jeanty drops and he moves and says he's available at the 9th overall pick for the Saints, do you see the Saints potentially looking at taking Ashton Jeanty despite having Alvin Kamara on the roster as well?
I think there would be intrigue. I think that it's hard to leave this draft without a running back wherever you draft one because of how ridiculously good this running back class is. I think for the Saints, the reasons are twofold that Ashton Jeanty becomes interesting to you if he's there at 9. The first of which is that he's a blue chip guy, right? And there aren't a lot of those guys in this year's draft. So if you get lucky enough for him to be there, he's going to be tempting. The other reason is just because you have Alvin Kamara doesn't mean that you're not planning for post Alvin Kamara, right? And it's very likely that any running back that you draft in this year's draft is probably still going to be on their rookie deal when the time comes, when the time is up between the New Orleans Saints and Alvin Kamara for whatever reasons that might be. And so I think that's the other thing you're looking for is somebody you can partner with Alvin Kamara for now, but then potentially to be the workhorse guy after Alvin Kamara. The issue with Ashton Jeanty that I think matters, but actually let me rephrase that. The issue with Ashton Jeanty that used to matter, that I don't know if it matters anymore because it's an entirely new coaching staff, is that he's got so many carries on his career. He's got a lot of work on those legs. And so for New Orleans, who typically likes to draft running backs that have less than 150 to 200 carries average per year in their experience, right? In their entire collegiate experience, they like guys that don't have so many miles. They like guys that have a lot of tread left on the tires. And Ashton Jeanty's, the opposite, the sort of counter product of both of those things. And so maybe that's something that scares away. But I don't know if they still care about that. If this new coaching staff cares about that the same way that the other coaching staff cared about that, and what that means for the scouting department, Jeff Ireland, who runs the scouting department, maybe Sean Payton didn't like that, but maybe Kellen Moore is okay with that because he just had incredible success with Saquon Barkley, who had miles on his engine coming into the NFL and has had miles since being in the NFL. And he was a 2,000-yard rusher last year. So maybe Kellen Moore doesn't care about that as much. So that would be the one thing that I would say maybe gets in the way. But I do think he would be intriguing for New Orleans. If they selected him, would be about who else is on the board.
So finally from me, Ross, what is a good draft for the New Orleans Saints come next week? What
Great
positions, you mentioned there some of the really big names that you like the look of if they were to fall to potentially 9. But what is a good draft for Mickey Loomis and for Kellen Moore to come out of that week and go, we're setting ourselves up well for not just 2025, but for the future of the organization as well?
Yeah, great question. I think you're wanting to maximize those picks as much as possible. What I mean by that is that if you walk away with, you've got 9 picks going in, if you still walk away with 6 of those selections being utilized within the top 150 and potentially get at least 1 or 2 more of those picks after that, so 7 to 9 picks being used, I think is helpful. I think if you show some attention to your defensive line, show some attention to your offensive line, show some attention to your pass catching room. So that could be your wide receivers or your tight ends. Add, a corner, I think is another big thing. If you can do those 4 things, then you've kind of hit the musts for the draft. Then if you can add other talent, walk away with a running back, look at a linebacker, because the Saints need to figure out what their future is going to be at that position. Maybe even invest in a versatile safety for post Tyrann Mathieu days, all those other things. Then it's what we call here in Louisiana, we call it lagniappe. It's a little something extra at that point. But the core things, I think, are those deals. Address your offensive line, help out your defensive line, get yourself a big bodied pass catcher that you can rely on, and then help yourself at cornerback. If they can walk away with those things and walk away with several players that at least have the potential to be starters, fewer questions, safer picks, all those kinds of things, then I think that's a successful draft. What I don't think makes this draft unsuccessful, however, is if they don't take a quarterback. If they pass on a quarterback, they're going to get C, D, and F level grades from analysts in the short term. But I think for the long term, if they're building around that quarterback and then figuring out who to plug in at quarterback later, that can still be just as successful. We've seen the Kansas City Chiefs win that way. We watched the Cincinnati Bengals win that way. We've seen the Detroit Lions win that way. We've seen a lot of teams that kind of went that route. And you've actually probably seen more teams be successful going that route than investing in the 1-1 quarterback, especially over the course of the past few years.
It's going to be absolutely fascinating to see how it all plays out. Ross, thank you so much for joining us here on talkSPORT Endzone. Just for our listeners here in the UK, for our viewers as well, just let us know how we can see all the great stuff that you're going to be doing in the build-up to the draft and beyond as well, focusing on the Saints and the Locked On Saints podcast as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You can find the Locked On Saints podcast, which now features the Saints Squad show as well, which is myself, Athlon Sports publisher John Hendricks, former New Orleans Saints wide receiver Lance Moore, and Saints Wire contributor Dylan Sanders, and myself. We do that show live every Monday and Thursday. You can find that on the Locked On Saints podcast, wherever you get podcasts, and on YouTube. You can find all the written work over at louisianasports.net. You can find it all in one place on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson Nola, Nola.
Looking forward to seeing what the Saints do next week and beyond as well. Ross, thank you so much for joining us here on talkSPORT. All the best for the season.
Back at you, buddy. Thanks so much.